Hey guys, welcome back to the Average Racer YouTube channel. Now, I assume the reason you clicked this video is because you yourself may be planning a forged Miata build. Or maybe you're just interested in the Ultra Street NB. Regardless of the reason, in this video I'm going to go over all the planning, decision making, and parts that I needed to get my engine to the machine shop. And possibly everything you're going to need to get your engine from a stock bottom end and stock head to a forged engine that can handle 3, 4, or maybe even 500 horsepower potentially. These BP blocks are incredible and can handle tons of power if you create them right. So in this video I'm going to be going over all that. And as another note, I just wanted to mention that I am not a mechanic, I'm just a huge Miata enthusiast, and most of the information in these videos I get from forum pages like miataturbo.net, the Miata Reddit, and lots of other sources online. So I implore you to do your own research and comment on anything that you think that I was wrong on. And without further ado, let's get to the rest of the video. So, the first step in building an awesome Miata engine is finding a good machine shop. Now, finding a good machine shop is just as important, or maybe even more important, than what parts you're even putting in your engine. A good machine shop should have friendly customer service and should never talk down to you for asking questions. Which, surprisingly, I've had a ton of machine shops do when I call them up and ask them certain things. People are just snarky. Now, for Miata specifically, you want to find a machine shop that has good experience with 4-cylinder import engines, like Hondas, Mitsubishis, Subarus. A lot of those guys do drag racing, so they're always rebuilding their engines. Or even better, if you find a machine shop that does Miatas specifically, but that's a lot rarer to find. As a side note, a sign of a good machine shop is that if they won't bore your block out without the pistons in hand first. Now, the reason for this is because if you give them your block and they don't have the pistons first, you can never get an accurate cylinder to wall clearance. So a good machine shop will always ask you to have the piston in hand first, which is what my machine shop said to me. It took me about a month to find the correct machine shop for me, which is 2 hours away from me. But they turned out to be one of the friendliest businesses I've ever worked with, and that's where my engine is at the moment. Next, I'm going to go into talk about connecting rods. Now, if there was one thing in the Miata engine that I could change to make way more power over stock, it would definitely be the connecting rods. The stock connecting rods are known as one of the weakest things in the Miata engine, and they really start to get sketchy anything over 220 wheel horsepower. Now, we're in luck because there's tons of different options when it comes to aftermarket connecting rods, but they really only boil down to 2 categories. The one that most people go with, and then the over-the-top, more expensive option, which I'll cover. Now, the first category, the one that most people go with, are cheaper name brand rods like Manley, Eagle, or any of the similar name brand rods that are made of 4340 steel. These rods are also kind of similar when I looked it up, and it really just boils down to brand recognition and what brand you choose to go with, but you're all going to get a kind of similar product when you go with one of these rods. And all of them save around 20 grams over stock rods, and all of these different brands of rods have been proven many times by Miata enthusiasts, and this is the way that I went with my engine. I got a set of Manley rods from Fab 9 Tuning. Now, you can go with cheaper rods than these cheap name brand rods, but there's one thing you got to keep in mind, is if they come with the ARP 200 rod bolts. Now, all of these rods from eBay or wherever are kind of going to be a similar product, but it really comes down to customer service and then what kind of rod bolts you're getting. So if they come with the ARP 200 rod bolts and you think that the brand is reliable, then go with the rod, it'll probably be fine. But if I'm going to be honest with you, I couldn't even find an example of a cheap eBay rod that also came with ARP 200 rod bolts. So just keep that in mind when you're buying rods. Now, your other option for connecting rods are going to be the Carrillo rods, or any similar very high-end, high-quality rod. Now, the main advantage of these rods is huge, which is the weight savings of rotational mass inside the engine. Now, the Carrillo rods specifically, you're going to save 100 grams lighter than stock. So if money is really no object and you need to rev as high as possible, these higher end rods are probably going to be the option for you. So, moving on from rods, now we're going to talk about pistons. Also, excuse my t-shirt change, just don't worry about that. Pistons are also very important when it comes to building a very high horsepower Miata, although not as important as the rods, because you can actually make pretty good horsepower on stock pistons. Think around 300 wheel horsepower or so. But anything over that, I would definitely suggest getting forged pistons, just because of how much heat you're generating, and it's just, too tight of stock clearances to make any more power. Another reason to go with the forged pistons is if you have cylinder damage and you're required to bore out your block anyway, they really don't make any oversized cast pistons, so you may have to go to a forged piston anyway. Now, going with forged pistons comes along with its drawbacks and benefits. The main drawback of running a forged piston is the greater thermal expansion of forged parts. So forged versus cast, forged is going to thermally expand much greater, and engines tend to cycle cool and hot. So when the cylinder is cold, you need to give it much more room to expand. So that's why when you turn on your car in the morning when the engine is room temperature or even colder than that, your piston is not going to like that because it's going to have a lot of clearance to bounce around in. So when you're running a forged piston, it tends to wear the cylinder walls more than a cast piston. So just think about that as its main drawback. But the main benefit is that you could run almost triple the horsepower or more than a cast piston. And running greater tolerances allows you to actually make more heat and withstand way greater stresses. And forged pistons don't crack as easily. I'm going to be going over the main pistons people choose to use in their forged Miatas, and I'm going to start with the Supertech piston option. Now, moving on to the Supertech piston option. The Supertech pistons have been proven time and time again by countless Miata enthusiasts, as have all the options I have listed on this list. The main difference between the Supertech pistons is that they are made of a 4032 aluminum alloy, whereas most other forged pistons are made of the 2618 alloy. The main difference between these alloys is the 4032 alloy has 12% silicone added to the mixture to make thermal expansion less severe when the piston is cold. Now this is awesome because that's actually the main disadvantage of running forged pistons, is that you may get increased cylinder wear when cold. So when you start the car, the piston will expand less and allows you to run tighter clearances. But the degree to where this actually helps has been heavily debated among the Miata community. And of course, every advantage does come with a trade-off somewhere. And the disadvantage to running the 4032 aluminum alloy is that you end up having 12% less aluminum in the actual piston, which makes it more prone to cracking and in general less strong than the other alloy option. And it's well known that the 2618 alloy can withstand much more abuse without cracking than the 4032 alloy. That being said, the 4032 alloy is still a very strong metal, and people have made hundreds of horsepower on them, but if you're going for the maximum power, you may want to step up to the greater alloy, as it's stronger and debated whether the silicone actually decreases the amount of cylinder wear. Now, this takes me to another very popular option when it comes to Miata pistons. This is going to be the Wiseco Pistons. Now, these pistons are obviously made of the 2618 alloy, which has mostly aluminum. But these are still regarded as one of the best pistons you can buy, along with some other similar brands like JE and CP pistons. But at this point, when it comes down to these similarly designed pistons, it really just comes down to brand preference, just like I said with the rods. I'm also skipping some of the more expensive pistons and some of the lower option pistons just because there's so many out there, and these two pistons that I'm listed right here are the main types. But when you're looking at the piston, really just look at the alloy and the manufacturer, and you can really use this representation to figure out what the piston is all about. On the Ultra Street MB, I am running a set of Wiseco pistons in the smallest size that they sell, which is the 83.5mm overbore. That's only 0.5 over stock. And with the lowest compression rating they sell, which is the 8.8:1 compression. Now, I chose the Wiseco piston based on many discussions that I've had with other Miata enthusiasts and tuner shops and such, and it just came down to the fact that people were telling me a lot that the Wiseco pistons stay just as quiet as the Supertechs when you do the cylinder clearance right, and it just made sense to me to go with the extra strength of the Wisecos. Also, as an added note about pistons and compression ratios, you're going to want to run the lowest compression ratio option when it comes to having a boosted setup, either turbo or supercharger, because this will make it way easier to add boost without getting detonation in your engine. Now, it is possible to run higher compression ratios, and people have run them with great success, but it just makes it so much harder to tune if you don't really know what you're doing and you're just a beginner, and you really don't want to mess up your engine with that kind of thing. Now, this is just a quick explanation of this subject, but there are YouTube videos that dive way deeper, and I encourage you to check those out if you're interested in this sort of thing. But just for the sake of this video, if you're boosted, you definitely want lower compression pistons, and if you're naturally aspirated, you definitely want higher compression pistons, because you're going to want to squeeze out every little horsepower that you can get out of one of these engines, naturally aspirated, which isn't that much, by the way. Now, moving on to a topic arguably more important than the piston you're choosing itself, is your piston to wall clearance. Now, what is a piston to wall clearance? So your piston to wall clearance is really self-explanatory. It's the distance between your piston and your cylinder bore when cold. Now, this distance is going to vary with how much power you're trying to make out of your Miata engine. But as a general rule, what I've seen talking to people from Wiseco and what I've seen people run in the past and have success with is you really don't want to go past a 3 thousandths to 3.5 thousandths cylinder to wall clearance if you're building a street engine, which most people are. That's usually right around the point where you're going to be able to make good power and also avoid excessive cylinder slap on startup. You really don't want to have huge cylinder to wall clearances, as you can generate more heat and they get more abuse, but usually people run those if they're running drag cars or engines that aren't going to last very long anyway. Now on the Ultra Street NB, I'm running a 3.5 thousandths cylinder to wall clearance, and I got this number directly from Wiseco when I told them how much boost I was planning to run, and they said that should be good for 15 to 20 pounds of boost, but I can honestly probably make more, as I've seen people make more boost with less cylinder to wall clearance, but I decided to take the number straight from Wiseco, and that's the number I'm going with on my build. Now, let's move on to the slightly less interesting topic of bearings. Main bearings, rod bearings, and thrust bearings. There are mainly two brands of bearings that I hear people running repeatedly. I'm talking about the ACL bearings and King bearings. And there are probably many other good brands of bearings as well, but these were the two that most Miata enthusiasts talk about, and ones that I decided between when I was doing my research. So if you have another brand of bearing, you should probably look into that on your own. I'm just talking about the ACL versus the King. So what I've learned from reading the forums and talking to various Miata specialty shops is that really both the ACL and King bearings are fine to use in your Miata application. It just comes down to another case of your brand preference. Which brand do you think is better, which brand is worse? One is slightly more expensive, that's the Kings versus the ACL, but people like to say the ACL is better. So another case of brand preference, just like the rods and just like some types of pistons and such. The reason I ended up going with the Kings on my build was because they were in stock at the time. A lot of people will tell you there's shortages of this or that, so if one of them's out of stock, you should probably just go with the other one. People say both are very similar. Now, another decision you need to make is whether you want the race version of whatever brand of bearing you're getting. Now, the race version of whatever bearing is usually going to sacrifice longevity for performance in an engine. Kind of like the different piston alloys that I explained earlier. Although every brand is different, so definitely look into the specific race bearing you're looking to buy and see if it's similar or different from another bearing. For the Ultra Street MB, I went with the King XP Tri-Metal race bearings. One of the reasons is because they were in stock at the time, and the other reason is because I want the high performance bearing for my motor. And if I'm being honest, I messed up and I didn't research the topic fully when I chose my bearings. And maybe I would have went with a non-race bearing if I knew that I was sacrificing longevity for performance, because I do kind of want longer street durability on my engine. But similar to how I chose the aggressive pistons, we'll see how they do on the street. Also, for thrust bearings, most people go with the OEM Mazda thrust bearings, although other brands of thrust bearings would probably work okay as well. Now that I'm done talking about bearings, let's get into an even less interesting topic, machine work. I'm going to go over some of the machine work that I had the machine shop do to just my block, I'll get to the head later, and maybe what you're going to need to do to your block to get your engine to be perfect. Obviously, I did need to get my block bored out to 83.5mm, because I am running a BP engine and stock is 83mm bore. But I also had the shop balance my crankshaft and lightly deck the block as well to get a perfect sealing surface for the head gasket. Also, very important, I told the shop to double check for out of round when they put in my upgraded main studs, because when you apply higher clamping force to the main journals, they can actually become out of round, and that would be very bad for your crank. So if they are out of round, you definitely want to get them either line honed or line bored, because you definitely do not want out of round main journals. Now, this brings me to my next topic of ARP hardware. Upgraded engine hardware, like head studs and main studs. Now, it's generally accepted in the Miata community that if you're running boost, you definitely want upgraded hardware, like main studs and head studs. And there really aren't that many options out there that are accepted other than the ARP brand, so it is a pretty easy choice. And of course, that's what I'm running on my build. Although there was recently a very big shortage of the ARP, and a lot of companies compensated like Fab9, and they made their own version, which apparently are even better than the ARPs. So those are probably fine to run as well. But you definitely want to get upgraded hardware for your boosted Miata build. Next, I'm going to be talking about oil pumps. Now, for the Miata, there's really only one brand of upgraded oil pump, and that's the Boundary oil pump. The Boundary oil pump solves the problem of the stock oil pump gear shattering under high horsepower conditions. Now, having a good damper on your engine can really solve this problem because it makes the crankshaft have less torsion, but you should probably get a upgraded oil pump even if you have a good damper. Although if I were to pick between getting a good damper or upgrading the oil pump, you should definitely get the damper, because the main problem and what breaks the gear is the torsion. So if you fix the torsional problem with a better damper, then you're less likely to break your stock oil pump. And just upgrading the oil pump is not really solving the problem of the torsion. You're just basically letting the oil pump live longer. So if I was choosing either one, I would definitely go with the damper instead of just having the torsion stay there and just upgrading the oil pump. On another note, there is another oil pump made by Boundary that upgrades the housing and not just the gear, and this allows you to actually flow more oil and make more oil pressure in your engine. But you really only need this if you're running a VVT engine, as it's required to have that extra oil pressure to run the VVT solenoid. Although it's never a bad idea. On the Ultra Street NB, I went with the first option where it just upgrades the gear, and I got that oil pump with a 72 PSI shim. The shim basically just restricts the oil from the pump, like the diversion valve, until it reaches a certain PSI. I think stock is around 65, but increasing that is good if you have a turbo or other accessories that are using oil, like an oil cooler. Now, after your upgraded oil pump that I hope you have, what sits in front of it is your engine damper. Now, if you're pushing big power, you're definitely going to need an upgraded damper. And when talking about upgraded Miata dampers, there's really only two options that you can choose from. The two good options for dampers are the fluid damper and the ATI damper. Now, both of these dampers are fantastic and tested in the Miata community extensively, although the ATI is more popular because it's been around longer. Now, both of these dampers work in fundamentally different ways, but they do relatively the same thing, is dampen the engine at varying RPM ranges, one using fluid and one using different durometers of rubber, if I understand it correctly. And there are differences in what RPM ranges they work at, but they're still going to be light years better than the stock damper. In my opinion, the installation of the dampers actually matter more than how they work. The ATI damper's been around a long time, and it has the timing gear of the engine built onto the back of it, and it's a press fit onto the engine. So you get the damper and the timing gear in one piece, and you press fit it onto the crank. Whereas the fluid damper works exactly like the stock one, and you just bolt it on using the 4 bolts. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to each one. The press fit is definitely going to give you a tighter fit and decrease, movement around the damper, and is going to increase your level of dampening. Although the fluid damper, the installation is 10 times easier in my opinion, and you can work on your engine much easier with the fluid damper. And if the stock damper made the 4 bolts work, I don't see why the fluid damper can't. Another huge advantage to running the fluid damper is you can use your stock trigger wheel because it fits just like the OEM damper. The ATI damper, you have to change a lot of things around to get a special custom trigger wheel to fit, so that's something to keep in mind when going with the ATI damper, although there's tons of tutorials that show you how to do it, so it's not impossible. For the Ultra Street NB, I did choose a fluid damper because, as you can hear the bias in how I'm talking about it, I just think that the installation is so much easier and that you can use your stock trigger wheel. And I would have gone with an upgraded trigger wheel as well, but to pass emissions in New York State, you need to be able to swap your stock ECU in and then, do a bunch of stuff to make it legal again and then take it in. And if I got an upgraded trigger wheel, that would just make it so much harder to swap back to stock when I need to. Now we're going to be moving on to the Miata cylinder head. And we're going to be discussing what parts and machining I needed to go through for my cylinder head and what parts and machining you might need for your cylinder head. Now, many people have built Miata engines and just stuck a bone stock head on the Miata engine and made really good power on it. But with how soft the stock springs are, and seeing as most bone stock heads are super worn out with tons of miles, those valve springs are going to be really soft, and they were even soft brand new from factory. So if you're running a bone stock head on a built engine, you're almost always going to have valve float. Valve float just means that your valve is not following the cam properly, and it's being flung off the cam, and your valve is opening even when it's not supposed to. And this can happen for various reasons like RPM, but the thing we care about most with Miatas is actually boost. So the boost pressure is trying to push on the back side of the valve, and it's being flung off the cam when it's not supposed to. And when you combine this boost pressure, even with the stock operating RPM of the Miata engine, you're almost always going to see valve float occurring. Even when running a lower horsepower number, some people even say it happens in the 200 wheel horsepower just because any boost is just going to start forcing that valve open. Although for Miata specifically, this problem can actually pretty much be ignored in a sense, because the Miata is a non-interference engine. So if this is happening and you're just not increasing horsepower, you're not actually really going to damage your engine internals, because non-interference means that the valves never contact the piston. So even if it's staying open a little bit longer, you're losing horsepower, but that piston isn't going to care because it's not ever going to hit it, even if it was fully open. But it should also be known that valve float can damage your cylinder head because they crash down instead of sliding down with the cam. They're riding the cam and they slide down. If it's floating, it just crashes down. So that can really damage your valve seats. But it really is a real option to just stick a bone stock head in your built Miata and just go for it. Because honestly, head work is really expensive and you can still make good power on stock heads and people swear by it. But in my case, I really don't like the idea of valve float and I just want my head to be just as good as my engine block. So let me talk about some options for upgraded valve springs. And for Miatas, unfortunately, there's not very many affordable options. Actually, I should say there's not any affordable options at all. And the valve spring upgrading path really falls into two categories. Those categories are the kits that are really expensive, and then trying to find the Volvo springs, which is a whole nother topic. The Volvo springs were used in the past, in like early 2015 and years back, because they were direct swap and they had way better seat pressure than the stock Miata springs. But in 2022, if you follow the forum links and follow all the stuff, a lot of them have been scooped up and they're really hard to find. They were from an older Volvo and not a lot of places carry them, and if you can find them, there's only a couple in stock. So if you want to go on a treasure hunt and try to find the fabled Volvo valve springs, you're going to get a super good deal and really nice valve springs. I honestly tried to get them for my build, but I literally could not figure out how to source them or anything, and I looked on the forum pages forever, but if you can end up finding them, good on you. So let's talk about the super unaffordable option, the valve spring kits. And I'll start with the Supertech kit. With the Supertech valve spring kit, you're going to get three options to choose from for spring sizes. So there's going to be double springs and single springs. The single spring option is going to be a 56-pound spring. And then for the double springs, you have the light doubles and the heavy doubles. The light doubles are going to be a 64-pound spring, and the heavy doubles are going to be a 74-pound spring. So I'm going to break down these options for you. So the singles are always a very good option. They're going to be way better than the stock springs, but they aren't going to be as good as the doubles. They're going to be about $50 cheaper to go with the singles. I think from $420 to maybe $375 or something cost. It's not that big of a difference. And then you want to move up to the doubles. You have the double light and the double heavy. The double light is going to be a 64-pound, and that's the one that I see most people going with when I'm researching it. Everyone goes with the double lights because it's in the middle of not being too aggressive and being better than the single spring for a good, well, not really a good price, but it's just a little bit more than the singles. The double heavy springs, from my research, are really only used in real performance race applications because they can damage your valve train by being such a heavy spring and so powerful. They can damage your cam and damage your valve seats. So it's best to go with the middle option, in my opinion. Now, Fly Miata also sells a valve spring kit of their own, which runs around $500-ish, maybe a little bit less. But they only come with the 74-pound springs, so they're going to automatically be the aggressive spring. So if you're wanting to choose an aggressive spring, you can either choose between the Flying Miata or the Supertech, although the Supertech really is the only option if you want to go for that middle ground spring. So that's why I'm saying there's very few options for springs. Now on the NB, I went with that middle ground option, and I went with the light double springs from Supertech. Now I'm going to be moving on to a head maintenance topic, and more specifically the valve stem seals. Now you have a couple categories when it comes to valve stem seals. You can either go with the OEM seals, which are regarded as the best, or you can go with aftermarket seals, which are less good but a lot cheaper. The OEM seals usually run over $100, and you have to buy them individually, so they're pretty pricey. That leads me to the aftermarket valve stem seal options. One of the best regarded aftermarket valve stem seals is the Fel-Pro valve stem seals, which you can get for under $30. And from what I've read on the forums, people have had really good results with these for being an aftermarket seal. And there are even cheaper options available than this one, like the Supertech valve stem seals and others, but I've heard really bad horror stories on the forums with those where they put them in and they instantly start leaking, and it's just not a good thing. So on my engine build, I ended up going with the Fel-Pro valve stem seals, but if you're really serious about your build, you can spend the extra money and go with the OEM ones. They will be better. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about the machine work that I'm having done to my head at the machine shop. So this starts with me telling you the reason why I had to rebuild my engine in the first place, or why I decided to, was because I overheated my engine being stupid. And this event caused my head to be warped by 7 thousandths, which I figured out when he took the straight edge to it and measured it with the feeler gauge. So the first thing I'm having done is having my head shaved flat, which it cost me around $150. And I'm also having my head be fully rebuilt by that machine shop with the Supertech light doubles and those Fel Pro valve stem seals. And that alone was like 600 bucks. So around maybe $750 for head work, for anyone wondering about pricing on that. And that's about all the machine work I had done on my head. In this next section, I'm going to talk about some engine accessories that I think are very important when building an engine and making more power, and they belong in this video in my opinion. And the first of those topics, I'm going to talk about engine mounts. Now, if you're boosting your car, you're definitely going to want to think about getting stiffer engine mounts. The stock engine mounts are usually ripped, and they let your engine move around a ton in the engine bay, even at stock power. And that makes it hard to shift, especially when you're in full power and you're wanting to go to second to third. You definitely don't want to miss that shift. Now, there are a ton of different options when it comes to engine mounts, but they really fall into two different categories. One of the polyurethane mounts and one of the rubber mounts that are a lot less noise harshness and vibration, and the polyurethane mounts increase noise harshness and vibration. Now, the first engine mount option I'm going to talk about are the Mazda Speed competition mounts. These are a direct fit and they literally look exactly like the stock mount, although the rubber is a much stiffer durometer. Now, because they still are rubber, these are actually regarded as the softest upgrade you can do, and it's going to limit the noise harshness and vibration the least out of all these different options. So they almost feel like stock or maybe a little bit stiffer than stock. But your engine will definitely be stiffer than the stock mount, so these are a good compromise. A lot of people on the Miata forums say that these mounts are not good enough for big power, so you may need a more aggressive option, which is the next segment I'm going to get into. This next segment is going to be your polyurethane mounts. So a lot of these mounts are not going to look like the stock ones. They're going to bolt in the same location, and they're going to usually have like a little metal arm and then bolt to a little polyurethane circle like the diff mounts on the stock Miata. And they're going to mount the engine in. So that material is only going to be about this thick around on the polyurethane mounts. A great example for this mount would be the ARW mounts or the Innovate mounts. These mounts are really going to increase noise harshness and vibration because they're going to just keep the engine way stiffer, and that stiffness is going to transfer directly into the car. Although it does matter what durometer polyurethane you're using on the mount, but they're always going to be way worse than a stock mount or a Mazda Speed comp mount. For my build, I got a set of Mazda Speed competition mounts because I'm hoping for stiffer mounts without having to sacrifice the noise harshness and vibration of the worst mounts. Although these really may be too soft for my power level, but I did get a really good deal on them on Facebook Marketplace. I only paid about 90 bucks for a set, and they're usually 200. So if these are too soft for my application, I'll just get the stiffer mounts. The next engine accessory I think everyone should have on their built engine, or really any Miata engine at all, are coolant reroutes. So the coolant reroute on a Miata is basically a mod that fixes the factory cooling system. Because the factory cooling system on a Miata is actually fundamentally flawed. So the engine block is sitting like this, the coolant is being pumped in the front of the engine, and then the outlet is also in the front of the engine. So it goes like this, and imagine the engine's this long. How do you think the coolant is getting back to the rear cylinders? So the rear cylinders on a stock Miata cooling system are always going to be hotter, even if it's just slightly, but if you're pushing your engine at all or making big power, that's just going to exponentially increase. So this mod is really a great addition to any Miata because all it does is really just improve the cooling system. Here's a diagram from Super Miata that shows what I'm talking about right here. So there are a variety of coolant reroute kits available from pretty much every Miata vendor you can think of, and people that even aren't big Miata vendors as well. And through my research and through my specific problems, I've found a couple of things to look for when looking for a coolant reroute kit. The first problem I came across is, does it work with my EGR port? Yep, that's right, I'm worried about emissions equipment on my race car. Because I do live in a state that does do the OBD2 checks, and from my research on the forums and such, it's really hard to trick the EGR port. Some people plumb the blow-by or the crankcase pressure right into the EGR, and some people say that works. Some people say to just block it off and that works. But I just want to make sure that I can get that code passed so I can plug in my stock ECU and have all the readiness codes go away. And the other main problem people have with coolant reroutes is the really long hose that comes off the back of the engine that goes all the way around the side. What can happen is the placement of the radiator on the stock car, it's not over on the side completely. It's over a little bit like this to match up with the coolant housing on the front of the engine. So a lot of the time they'll make it so that it just goes straight. So sometimes you have to kink it and then it can get kinked up, and some people put springs in it. So if you get a good quality kit, you won't have to deal with those issues. So the cheaper you go with your kit, the more you're gonna have to play with your kit and maybe edit it a little bit to get it to work. So the two higher quality kits that I recommend, that I'm looking into, are ones that work with the MB1 EGR, and those are going to be the Flying Miata coolant reroute and the Super Miata Q-Max coolant reroute. Both these brands are high quality and big names in the Miata community and have been proven and tested before. Or if you're on a really big budget and you don't mind playing with your kit a little bit to get it to work, and you're in a state that doesn't care about EGR and you can just block it off, there's an awesome kit that I was looking into from Skid Nation. I'll put it on the screen right now. Now, there are a ton more kits out there, but I just went over these 3 real quick, but you can probably tell what category your kit fits under by looking at the price and also calling the manufacturer and asking them questions like, does it fit your EGR, and does the coolant hose tend to kink, and stuff like this. Now, the last and final topic I'm going to talk about are the gaskets required to rebuild your whole engine after you do this build. Now, many companies sell full engine rebuild kits, but you really want to find one that includes everything you need so you're not missing something when you're putting it together. And it's very important if they're using all Mazda OEM gaskets. You definitely don't want to spend all this money on a dope engine build and then just have it leak because of all these weird aftermarket gaskets. So I went with the big name, and I got my engine rebuild kit from Flying Miata. They had all OEM gaskets in their kit, and they included a lot of different stuff you need. They also had ACL race bearings available as an added option in the kit if you want to include those as well. The kit also comes with a full set of valve stem seals, which I actually didn't know, so I wasted my money on those. But hey, now I have another set of valve stem seals. But you don't have to make that mistake because you have this video. Now, the kit is pretty expensive, but I think it's a good value for what you get because you're really paying for the good parts that you want on your engine. And I really couldn't find any other websites that had a full complete kit like this. Although, prove me wrong in the comments, I want to know. And on to the final topic I want to discuss is head gaskets. More specifically, the OEM Mazda multi-layer steel head gasket, or MLS, versus the Cometic MLS head gaskets. The Cometic gaskets are usually much thicker than the OEM gasket, which results in a lower compression ratio, which is good and bad at the same time. And in theory, seals better than an OEM head gasket. There's been tons of discussion in the Miata community and on the forums whether you should go with a Cometic or a OEM Mazda head gasket. And long story short, after tons of research, if you're pushing insane power, think over 400 or 500 horsepower, then you might want to go with a Cometic head gasket. Or a more likely scenario where you're going to want to run a Cometic head gasket is if you're overboard more than 2 millimeters. So if you have a BP and you're bored to 85 millimeters, that's going to be right at the edge of where the stock head gasket can seal, so you're probably going to want to run a Cometic head gasket in that case. But other than those scenarios, people swear by the OEM head gasket, and that's what I'm running on my build. And pretty much any application you could think of, the stock head gasket is going to work pretty well for you. If you're still here at the end of this video, thank you very much for watching, and I hope this video helped you make informed decisions about what parts you want to run in your Miata build. I chose to not include any power adders in this video, like stuff that goes along with turbocharging and supercharging, like injectors and clutches. But if you want to see my thoughts on stuff like that, like turbochargers and superchargers and what injectors to run or fuel pumps, please leave a comment below and tell me. But anyway, hop in that Miata and stay rippin'. And I hope you have a great time building your Miata engine and have fun on your Miata engine building adventure. Peace!